Welcome, everybody, to our update on the protests in South Korea and the role of unions and workers there in the democratic process. Many of us have been reading and watching the dramatic news from South Korea, where the president declared and then quickly rescinded martial law, causing massive protests and calls for his impeachment. My name's Tobias Higbee, and I'm the director of the UCLA Institute for Research on Labor and Employment. And I'm joined tonight by Jennifer Chun, who is a professor of Asian American Studies and Labor Studies at UCLA and the associate director of our Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, and Hyewon Chong, the executive director of the International Affairs at the Korean Metal Workers Union. Now, I am not an expert in Korean labor history or politics, but Jennifer is, and obviously Hyewon is a participant in what's going on there right now. So I'm going to pass it on to Jennifer and sit back and enjoy this fascinating conversation. Jennifer, take it away.
Thanks, Toby. I couldn't be more thrilled to be able to have this conversation with Hyewon and also with you, Toby, and the IRLE and UCLA community to learn really about the events that are unfolding as we speak in South Korea. And really, I feel like there's no one better than Hyewon to talk to us today, especially about the role of workers, unionized workers, and the labor movement, and really protecting our democracy in Korea. And Hyewon has been active at various levels of the Korean trade union movement for over 2 decades, since 1996. In fact, when Hyewon and I met, I think you had just been in Korea for a year or two, and I had just got here as well. Hyewon was active at the enterprise level at Daewoo Motors in the Bupyeong plant. We had sort of been traveling back and forth as part of this class struggle, Yultong performance pet. Do you remember that, Hyewon?
Yeah,
Um,
drumming.
yeah, so at the enterprise level, to the federation level, and Hyewon was there when the Korean Metal Workers Federation also formed into the first industrial union, really, I think, driving this wave of transformation from enterprise level unions to the federation to an industrial union. She's also worked at the national level. The KMWU is affiliated with the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions at the international level and the International Metal Workers Federation, and now Industrial Global Union. Hyewon is also a Californian, raised in California, and she lives in Seoul now with her 8-year-old daughter. So she has her hands filled doing so many different things. And when we first saw each other last week in front of the National Assembly, it was just a few days after South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol declared and then revoked martial law after just 3 hours in the middle of the night. And then, night after night, tens of thousands of people, including unionized workers and trade unionists, poured into the streets in Seoul and around the country. When we first met, you had the very sort of next, I think the day before, you had let me know that 45,000 Hyundai workers and 10,000 General Motors workers walked off the line in protest, right? Demanding Yoon Suk-yeol's resignation and that he take accountability for what he would describe as the declaration of martial law that didn't even really count as one. We heard this from him yesterday. But workers took the lead in really refuting, I think, this this rationale, this justification. So before we dive into the specifics of the current political situation, I wanted to first ask if you could share some general background about the KMWU and the KCTU with people who may not be familiar with the Korean labor movement. And when the KCTU was founded in '95, and that's when it was officially established, there had been sort of years of the drive of workers for independent unions that really culminated in the explosion of the Great Workers' Struggle in 1987, which is, arguably the single most important event in Korean labor movement history, and is continually sort of referred to, I think, by the democratic labor movement as its sort of origin and birth, although we know that there is a long history of labor militancy and the struggle for independent unionism in Korea, tracing back to the Japanese colonial period. But during the Great Worker Struggle, hundreds of thousands of workers from different sectors around the country, including the light industries, garment, shoe, textile, sweatshops that really fueled the country's economic development in the early period, and then the auto and shipbuilding industries in the 1980s that really, I think, especially the metal workers, the auto unions and workers formed the base of KMWU, really broke free from this yoke of authoritarianism that had repressed independent unions for decades. And now, in the span of a few, we hear a lot about 12/12. In Korea, we call it shibi shibi, right? The day that the last sitting president, Chun Doo-won, actually declared martial law after the coup that he had waged on December 12th. And we hear a lot about this history now, and you yourself, as part of KMW, you just celebrated this. So why does this history, Korea's history of military rule, still loom so large for the KMWU and the KCTU-led democratic labor movement more broadly? And how do you think the memory and experiences of Chun Doo-hwan's regime and the democratic labor movement's historic role in toppling it affect workers' understanding of the current situation?
So yes, I think you're quite correct. The 1980s were an important time. So I'm not in the US, we might not be familiar, but throughout Asia, there were a lot of military dictatorships, authoritarian governments that justified their rule by economic development. Uh, and in order to help squash the rights of workers, a lot of these authoritarian regimes relied on yellow unions. So basically, after the first coup d'etat of Park Chung-hee, he dissolved all the unions, reformed it under a 9-member committee that was, decided by the KCIA at the time. And,
The
you know,
Korean
they,
Central
you,
Intelligence Agency,
that
yes.
at the time, right? So
Notorious.
the unions were the conveyor belt of control and wage restraint to the workforce on behalf of the government and employers. So in 1987, workers joined the June struggle for democracy, but more importantly, what differs us from Thailand, Indonesia, and other countries that at the same time had military dictatorships is that for 3 months, 1/3 of every worker in the country went on strike for 3 months. It's not a one-day strike. It was July, August, September. So it was almost like open class warfare. So workers, if you look at the leaflets from the time, they were saying things like, we're going to pick the president of the country by our own hand, and we're going to also pick our union leader in the shop floor by the workers, not by the company. And workers went on strike to ask for companies to stop interfering in workers' elections and, allowing workers to pick their own leaders. So having this very visceral experience of what it means, and workers are also demanding new constitution, all these kinds of democracy in the polity, but also in the economy, blah, blah, blah. And, 1.2 million workers on strike for 3 months, that leaves an impression on the workers, the employers, the government. And I think in particular, Korea's ruling elite seems to be very sort of entrenched in their power because they've been the ruling elite for so long. And even looking at Yoon, he's saying that he's going to dig his heels in, and he's calling on like his supporters to basically fight to the end is what he said in his speech yesterday morning. So, I mean, in other countries, you would expect, the ruling elite to sort of step down and defer to constitutional processes. But, in this country, we require the vigilance and the continued engagement and attention of the people in order to uphold democracy. So I think also, so part of this is that we had the great workers' struggle, that workers were an important actor in forming the Sixth Republic. So in Korea, the Sixth Republic is the Democratic Republic where we tried to give meaning to democracy. And it wasn't just the moment where, there was a sort of, retaking of direct democracy, and kind of voicing of this kind of aspiration for human rights and other, freedom of speech and the press and so on. But also in the years afterward, we really had to fight for a lot of institutional things. For example, so that police had to have name tags so that whenever we were beaten, we can at least hold someone accountable and there wouldn't be complete impunity. So it took decades to really put the roots of democracy down in the Sixth Republic, which we helped to found. So the declaration last week on Tuesday night of martial law showed everyone just how vulnerable democracy is. In the blink of an eye, it could all be wiped out, and the elected president who won by a very small margin could suddenly push us into military rule again. And so I think there were so many things that happened that night. So if there weren't 10,000 people like rallying in front of Parliament and keeping their phones, videotaping the soldiers who are going into Parliament and the police at the time, perhaps the soldiers might have used more force. I think there was a lot of other things. So for example, there was also some problems inside the police chain of command. So the Seoul Metropolitan Police started blocking the elected members of Parliament from going inside. But then without informing the National Police Agency. So he called them off. And in that small part of time, a lot of parliamentarians got in and then they put the forces down again. And so, I mean, there was some havoc. And so it seems like, just by our vigilance, our being there, our filming it, everyone's presence and, other kinds of things like the helicopters arrived late because of bad weather, we were able to have Parliament have a vote at all and our Constitution says that if Parliament, Constitution 77, Article 77 says if Parliament votes to lift martial law, the president has to do it. And, so this could, very easily have been a successful martial law attempt. And listening to the speech yesterday where the president is basically calling on his supporters and sort of spreading out these outlandish conspiracy theories about the April election, to galvanize his supporters to continue the insurrection. We are uncertain if he could commit martial law a second time, so it could happen again. And indeed, in that night, remember, he faltered. He didn't, so Parliament voted that it should be lifted at 1 a.m., but the president didn't actually announce that he would lift martial law until like 4:30 a.m. In between, after Parliament voted to lift martial law, he went to the control room and talked to other people and said things like, or so the testimony it goes that, oh, I can just call martial law again and you guys will all be okay. Go ahead and, wipe them out, round them all up, and so, I mean, we realize how vulnerable democracy is one thing. Then the second thing is a lot of sacrifices and blood. I mean, in Korea, we say that democracy grew on the blood of the people because it was not easy to retake power from the elite and to try to build democracy. It was very difficult. A lot of people suffered, workers were kidnapped and tortured and, it was not an easy process. So, we cannot just see all that sacrifice go up because we were apathetic and inattentive or we were sleeping on our watch or something. So this is why workers are standing up to, I mean, this is partly why, yeah. But yeah, so this history is part of our DNA that we helped to build democracy. We helped to build the Sixth Republic. We're not going to sit down and let democracy be destroyed like that.
One thing that I think really strikes people about the timeline is how quick and immediate the response was. And I'm really struck by your last point that Korean workers and the Korean labor movement is not going to just sit by and let all of this happen, right? Korean workers were literally first responders, along with a whole host of other social movement groups and oppositional party members, but was right there. So for people who don't know much about Korea, how is it that your union, KMWU, knew so quickly to go to the National Assembly building, right?
Yeah,
How did, others?
well, we already had precarious shipbuilding workers were already on hunger strike in front of Parliament at the time. And so the president of Korea, he really, I guess, had this kind of very heavy-handed repression of a 51-day shipbuilding strike. So you all know, everyone went through the coronavirus, or what you call COVID-19 in the West, I guess we call in Korea coronavirus pandemic. But like their wages were unilaterally cut 30% across the board off like 100 subcontractors inside one shipyard. And the subcontracted workers had gone on strike asking, because the subcontractors, like 90% of their subcontract is basically the wages of the workers, and 10% they keep for themselves. They can't address a 30% wage cut. Only the shipyard, the main company can do that. So they asked for bargaining to the main company. And the response was really, the company refused bargaining. So they went on strike, and they were sued for all of the what the company alleges are the costs of the missing production targets. So like 47 billion Korean won, which is like 35 million euro, to 5 subcontracted elected union leaders. The company doesn't expect them to pay this back, and the company doesn't need to pay them back. They just want to destroy the union, right? So there was this longer struggle and also, it looks like the government was also very involved in the breaking of the strike, because the Korea Development Bank threatened that they would have all of the shipyards, I guess, creditors, because you borrow money, you build the ship, and then you get it when you deliver the ship. They would recall all the loans from the shipyard unless the regular workers could make the precarious workers stop striking or something. And then the company tried to organize a vote for the regular workers to leave the union. And at the time, the company lost the vote. Our members decided to stay in the union, but then afterwards they continued to repress the union. So regarding this whole incident that had the heavy involvement of the Yoon Suk-yeol government, the precarious workers were already on hunger strike in front of the parliament. I should add that parliament had already acted to sort of address some of the concerns, to allow subcontracted workers to bargain. So the Korean law is not really allowing the subcontracted workers to bargain with the company that decides their wages and working conditions. So, I mean, obviously the shipyard owner is going to be able to address the health and safety concerns as well as the wage concerns. So in order to fix that, there was this law called the Yellow Envelope Law. So it actually was put in front of Parliament by a mass signature campaign after the strike was ended. And it passed Parliament, where they agreed that workers should not be because the companies can hold individual workers, sue them for the production delays. The companies have no pressure to go into bargaining, right? And so it's almost like unions are not legal if you could have like 35 million lawsuit for having gone on strike, and for which the company contributed to the prolongation of the strike by not bargaining, right? So it was a 51-day strike, and they were all like starving, right? So the yellow envelope law was passed. Well, actually, Parliament made 8 different versions to water down the version that was sent up by petition. But then the watered down version passed Parliament. But then the Yoon Suk-yeol, it's one of the 25 laws he vetoed, was the yellow envelope law, which was so important for us to have bargaining rights, and that workers could feel like we have the right to strike, because a strike that's legitimate by International Labor Organization standards should not be subject to like a 35 million lawsuit for, delays. Anyway, so they were already there in front of Parliament. So that was one, we already had this struggle going on. But then also a second aspect is that we are all on using I guess, social media like Telegram and Kakao Talk. So I was putting my daughter to bed, and suddenly my social media was like I was getting notification after notification. And when my daughter fell asleep, I looked at it and it's like, come to Parliament. There's like police who are, and then the soldiers and a tank, and this was all being alerted across the union. And I think the Democratic Party and parliamentarian people of parliament, they also have their own telegram rooms where so I mean, getting the word out was relatively fast. We are, we have a lot of internet connectivity, and we are also all using a lot of social media to be in touch. So on the one hand, that's a good thing about social media. On the other hand, listening to the president's speech yesterday about all those conspiracy theories are really from, like, they're not broadly supported. They're basically from these really, ultra right-wing extremist YouTubers. So I think there's two aspects to social media.
In yesterday in Yoon's speech, he explicitly named KCTU as one of the reasons why he felt he needed to protect the nation. Can you tell us a little bit about why Yoon would explicitly identify KCTU as one of the forces that are threatening the national security of the country, and then how this is kind of affecting the KCTU-led labor movement sort of response and demands for impeachment and also punishment for crimes such as insurrection and treason.
Well, so actually, yeah, so Yoon had made up a list of people that he wanted the Korean National Intelligence Service to round up and detain in a B1, so what do you call it? A basement bunker where they have detention facilities in case of war. But so he sent the intelligence services to the various places where they could detain political detainees and ascertain they had enough space and blah blah blah. So on the list was like the ruling party leader, the opposition party leaders, a lot of different people, but also the elected president of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, which would be like the AFL-CIO president. But then partly, I think, like, looking at his list too, anyone who disagrees with him is basically like an anti-state, anti-state force or something. Like, because I think we had a lot of difficulties because President Yoon was really carrying out a strong attack against trade union rights. So it's not only that 51-day strike at Daewoo Shipbuilding, which is now called Hanwha Ocean, but it's also at the construction union. Construction unions are like they have the same tactics all over the world, calling for bargaining and so on. And he was depicting that as, thuggery and, uh like violating the Fair Trade Act or something. Like, it's almost like he doesn't recognize the legal existence of trade unions' right to exist. I mean, to call like collective bargaining like a violation of, the fair trade, what do you call this? Ah, uh, I'm not sure why the word is slipping from me, but yeah, calling it sort of like unfair collusion to determine prices. But this is what trade unions do, right? This is like, we ask for, workers' wages to have fair standards. This shouldn't be subject to that kind of I guess, fair trade or anti-competition allegation. So you might remember that one of the so the president was basically sending out people to round up construction union leaders and accuse them of, like, being like a mob or something like this and violating anti-competition laws. And one of them committed suicide in protest. And I mean, even that he would commit suicide in protest in a democratic era, and that the government, the head of the government, would have such, like, the it's like a hatred of trade unions, the way he speaks of trade unions. And I mean, this person clearly is not comfortable with, having checks and balances, but then clearly also I think there's some aspect of workers, not being seen as even some, social partner or even junior social partner or something. But yeah, so there was a long campaign. And then it's not only that in the construction sector, but even in the metal sector, for example, like precarious steel workers were holding a sign, asking the CEO to please accept the Supreme Court ruling about their the sort of illegitimate there were illegitimate hiring arrangements that deprived them of rights. Anyway, so uh they basically sent in police and, handcuffed the workers and dragged them out, surrounding them. So, I mean, all this we were seeing a lot of this falling back to the old use of violence and force and brute, and in the shipyard workers strike, for example, the president also sent in special forces, who basically practiced the repression of the strike so in that strike also, for shipbuilding workers to show how impossible the situation was, they went on strike, but then they were continually attacked by the company, like physically beaten and their tents torn down. And so in order to protect the rank and file from having to face so much violence every day, one of the vice chairs of the shipyard local, he welded himself into a 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter cube on the bottom of a very large crude carrier they were building in the docks. And so, a person who is an adult cannot even lie down in such a small cage. But it was this human cage protest. He put the sign up, I'm sorry to disturb you, but we cannot live like this, can we? To just show. But then sorry, so this kind of so the special forces were practicing how they were going uh to I guess suppress his action right next to him. Like so his action is sort of innately not aggressive. It's not hurting other people. He's inside a cage, he can't hurt anybody, but then, there's show of force and repression continually. I think workers have been expecting that workers' rights would be more upheld after the government ratified the ILO conventions 87 and 98, but then partly because of this, we have been calling for a change, let's say. Sorry, that ended up being a lot longer than I wanted it to be.
I mean,
But yeah.
I think I think it really shows just how much and like the scope and the extent to which workers have to face um, in multiple arenas. I mean, especially at KMWU, I know that you represent workers across the supply chain in the auto industry. So from, probably kind of workers that have the most secure manufacturing jobs, with the most kind of well-known and, well-resourced chaebol corporations to kind of workers in multiple subcontract tiers of contracting, right? Who don't even know who their employer is. And we haven't even talked about migrant workers that are undocumented that have routinely face kind of just this intimidation and threats all the time. Especially around deportation or just their everyday physical harm. So I think what we're hearing is that even the most, I would say KMWU is one of the most powerful industrial unions in Korea, and yet workers are dealing with the psychological assault of being degraded all the time by the nation's leader, but also by political parties, not being protected, left being abandoned, and really kind of showing this really kind of diverse repertoire from walking off the line, showing their numerical strength, like the GM and Hyundai workers did, to this human cage protest. So I wanted to ask, how like as for someone who has worked at KMWU and has been part of the labor movement, how do you think about this protest repertoire? And, just to disclose, I've been thinking about this protest repertoire for such a long time, but I haven't necessarily thought about it from the perspective of auto workers. I've been thinking about it from the perspective of women in service industries that don't have this history of militant unionism to draw upon. And yet they turn to not only these historic forms like hunger strike or factory occupations, but we're seeing sort of newer forms like 고공농성, these high altitude occupations, 삼부일배, 오체투지, right, these Buddhist full body prostrations, and now this human cage. So for you, I guess I'm curious, how do you think about this changing protest repertoire? And maybe I know Toby has a question and I'll turn it over to you in a second, but also how is this helping us think about um, the solidarities kind of between and among workers in different positions and between workers and social movements more broadly? I know that's a large question, so answer however you.
Okay, I think I'll just answer the first part first and let a follow-up question handle the second part. So the first part, actually, like 고공농성, which is the aerial strike or aerial protest, this is actually very old. So the origins are that, if you so much as said something, you would be arrested right away. But if you went up somewhere very high and put down a banner and protested, as they are suppressing you, you could fall off and die. And so they could kill you, and it's very visible. And so people chose this as a way because it could let them protest longer, because the authorities would have to figure out how to drag you out from atop of a high structure without, causing more, without causing more problems for themselves or headache for themselves. So that's sort of the origin of the aerial protest. So that was actually a very long, and we've had that, I mean, throughout our history, we've had a lot of those. But I think yeah, so how do the dispossessed show the situation like the human cage symbolically shows like everyone whose wages were unilaterally cut during the COVID-19 pandemic, is feeling like, oh, how can we continue like this, but it I mean, so I actually we have so in our union, we have a culture director, and she actually promotes discussions among workers, how can we, bring the meaning of this home to the people who are participating, to the people who are watching, and not just sort of rely on, mannerisms or something, but but the culture director also does other things. So for example, that we are aware of a lot of people could have an amazing rich worker history, but then don't appreciate it. So part of the culture director also, we have various groupings inside our union that remember each of the labor martyrs who gave up their lives in the fight to create democracy and allow trade unions and for workers' rights. So I think part of it is that we are intentional about about knowing where we come from and where we're going. So, I mean, then, yeah, and then I think some other parts of the question were also that, yes, we are a very diverse union. So even like, from the huge chaebol who are the engines of Korea's export economy in steel, in auto, in shipbuilding, these are our union members. But also we have union members who joined the union and we find out they're still getting their wages in envelopes. And we're like, no, you have to sign a labor contract. You have to, so, I mean, because the metal sector is so diverse in our country, and because our constitution in our union is that we will organize everyone. And the reason that we actually moved away from the federated to a national union structure is that we wanted to be able to encompass vulnerable workers in the economy, like women workers, migrant workers, people who are pushed to the ancillary. Like if you are in a factory of 30,000 people, and you all go on strike, you'll have some power via your employer. But if you are in a factory of 7 people or 20 people, it's awfully difficult to form a union. So this is the reason why we changed from a federated structure with the focus on enterprise unions to a national union. We have one union for everyone. We gather the union dues from everyone at 1% of their wages. So those who have more pay more, those who have less pay less. And we decide nationally, where is the need? So we figure if we don't do this and it's just enterprise unions giving like a few 25 cents per head to the above structure, they'll leave a lot of money on the bottom. So they'll maybe make t-shirts or towels or something, and they'll be happy to have that, but they won't have power in the economy. They won't have power in the polity. In order to have, we need to have an encompassing union that reflects our population as well as the migrant workers who are among us. And in order to do that, we need to redistribute money away from making t-shirts and into organizing, basically, for precarious and people who are in like industrial parks, but in small workplaces. So we are trying, like, by our practice also to who needs more should receive more, and who has more should give more, this kind of a thing in our union. I'm not sure if but protest cultures, yeah. So, perhaps this needs also a follow-up interview. So with our culture director, because she's also published, we don't want it to become just kind of like, we want people to keep their authenticity and to really be part of a movement and not just, mannerisms and so on.
I mean, this is so fascinating from an American perspective. The fact that you have a culture director is a great idea. And also it's really fascinating to hear how your union has embraced precarious workers because, in the United States, obviously we have relatively low union density. And one of the issues is that there are many smaller enterprises where it is very difficult to unionize. And historically, actually, many of the unionization campaigns were in these relatively small places where, union elections were for, 25 to 50 to 75 people. But that becomes very hard to sustain. And I think it's a challenge for unions in the United States, just as the perhaps dryness of some protest culture can be less than inspiring, just marching around in a circle and chanting. Whereas what you're describing are these like very inventive and dramatic interventions in the public dialogue about what's going on in democracy in the workplace, et cetera. I was curious listening to you, you answered it in part, but how it is that you mobilize people, whether it is to the specific protests, that you're describing or to these larger protests. You talked about Telegram, but are there also structures within the organizations where people are, in what way is the union kind of like consciously structured in order to turn people out for actions that one presumes they've, decided to do jointly?
Yeah, that's right. That's completely right. So the speed with which we were able to know that something was happening is partly because we are so well connected. But then you're right, the crucial backbone that allows us to respond to what's going on in our society is that we have structures. So, there are lot of places where the union is a one-man show, but then that's not here, we cannot have the union a one-man show, and we are allergic to that kind of thing anyways, so it's not in our DNA is really demanding a stronger, more meaningful democracy. Even our members from us, so our members so for us the night that the coup happened, there was a Central Executive Committee meeting of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions. A martial law has been declared. What should the trade unions do? And so that will include all the sectoral people as well as all the regional people. And in the metal union, we have a similar body, the KMWU Central Executive Committee. So I think in the US, you call them districts. We call them regional branches. But then, so in every district, union leaders from that district will come to the Central Executive Committee, as well as leaders from some of the big companies that are important to the export economy. And we'll discuss together, what are we prepared to do? And they will also have a better feel on what the rank and file are thinking and how they're reacting. And so the KCTU had their meeting on the night of the coup, and we had, so the next morning, I'm also interchangeably calling it a political coup, because we also have like the pro-Yoon coup collusive forces as well. So the next day, uh, because we're a national union and people have to travel in order to meet, to have a physical meeting, we also tend to prioritize physical meetings because you can get out your doubts and everything in a physical meeting, which is difficult in an online meeting. But then, so we had it in the afternoon at 2 so the coup was on the Tuesday night, so Wednesday at 2 in the afternoon. So everyone who is a leader from their district and the big companies all came together at the table and discussed, what our response should be. And the response was that we should go on strike. We do not accept that someone who declared martial law, suspended our habeas corpus, suspended our right to strike and all our trade union rights, to remain the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and sit there in the seat of president. We do not accept this. And so this is why we started. So that was on Wednesday. And so on Thursday and Friday, by decision of the Central Executive Committee, we would be going on strike, calling on Yoon to step down, because we don't want this political or this crisis of democracy to become prolonged and then to return to business as usual and so on. We need to have some kind of clarity. Yeah, we don't accept the continuation in the seat of power, someone who has traded democracy for military rule. Yeah, it's pretty unacceptable. So the having representative structures that are viewed as legitimate by our members, that's really crucial. Yeah. So, and it wasn't just, one person's decision, it was a decision of this body. So that's another thing that I think is important in our union, is that we often decide things in committee, instead of one person calling the shots. So we can hear all the views, but not one person was against it. Everyone actually was unanimous. We can't let this just go. This is a challenge to democracy. We cannot leave it unanswered. Yeah.
Hyewon, can you also share a little bit about the kind of nuts and bolts of how the union organizes? I mean, what's really interesting is yesterday, I'm in Jeju, and it's the 8th consecutive day of protests in front of the city hall in Jeju City, and you always see a union van with a loudspeaker. I saw several different contingents of union members sort of wearing vests, and of course, all of the flags. And so, I think people would also, I think the representative structure, the democratic collective decision making, the readiness of the leadership, but also the rank and file to respond immediately is absolutely fundamental to the story. And then there's also all the capacity, all the union infrastructure and movement infrastructure to sort of move people. So I'm curious, like how does that happen in Korea? Why does it seem so seamless? And what what enables you to keep up that sort of high level of mobilization capacity?
Well, I think there are several factors, and one factor would be that because we use it, we are always, because we're pretty active. So, I mean, for us, one of the first things that we do when we are organizing a workplace is to sort of increase the capacity of the shop floor to act together. So it'll be on health and safety or something like that. I mean, increasing the capacity of workers to act together in their interests is not just us representing them, but then that, this is part of our union movement. So this is one thing, is that, we encourage, I mean, aside from having a culture director, we also have an education department, and we also, engage people, we don't, I mean, it's not just numbers, but then people who think similarly, who have the same values, who are able to act together. I mean, there are several things that are needed to create a union movement. But I think in our case, 1987, that was, those people basically created the conditions in which our union could exist. And I mean, and then there were so many different times that they were called to act. So like, I'm not sure if you remember, we had our union also went on a week-long strike against the conclusion of the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement. And, we also went on strike against, I mean, during various moments, also like, during the Park Geun-hye regime as well. So I think that our members all have like a general strike in their living memory. So, I mean, so the people in those past, many of them have already entered retirement, but then people have the memory of their own struggle that succeeded to change the world. And so I think this is like, kind of like, bone structures. If you don't have like constant pressure, it doesn't stay as dense, or, like, what do you call it? Limbs that you don't use that, could be atrophied away or something like over time. The trade union's ability to respond to what's happening is also, partly your normal practice. Do you normally respond to things that are going on? You normally, then, you'll be more prepared, to respond when something happens. And also I think having in order to calling a general strike, you have to have some level of confidence in your union members, and so and then the union members also have to have confidence in the union leaders to actually walk out. So, I mean, part of this is built up over time and continued, like, unions responding. So, I mean, I think, yeah, so, but then I think also it's so in our union too, we have developed some organizational discipline as well. So it's not all, fun and games, but also that when we all decide together to go on strike, then we expect that, everyone does what they can to create the effect that we are aiming for. So, yeah, so I think that's also, it's a partly the internal organizational culture, I think, in the metal sector that, people would be ashamed if they just were like, it's too much trouble, or I can't do this, or, people would be ashamed if they didn't stand up and do their best at a time of such urgent crisis of democracy. So I think, yeah, so we have like this organizational memory that's kept as a living memory because we've had various moments of large scale mobilization, and that is political, like what we have today. I'm not sure, did that answer the question?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, if we just even think of the past 20 years, the general strike in 95, 96, the post-IMF mass mobilizations, going into the early 2000s with the start of the candlelight protest movements, the anti-FTA, or what they call the anti-beef, US beef protests, all the way up into the demand to depose and sort of impeach Park Geun-hye in 2016-17. So often organized labor is there and in the streets. There's also, kind of a stereotype And one thing that I heard when I did my research was there's a sort of stereotype of the metal worker union, sort of being entrenched in sort of the old ways of doing unionism. Um, and kind of really, because of this history, uh, opting for quote unquote violent versus peaceful tactics. And, one thing I hear a lot in the news these days is people are really praising the kind of festival-like atmosphere, the youth and their K-pop sticks, and this is kind of this is an offshoot from 2016, 17, when people were like, for the first time in history, the ordinary person, not the sort of trade unionist willing to risk their life to change history, can go out there and participate in change making. And so you have this kind of antagonistic perception, in a way, of sort of the old unionist and the new kind of forward-looking, joyful protester. But when you go to the protests, everyone's there, including the metal worker unionists, organized labor, all of the labor social movement coalitions that were part of making that historic 87 democratic transition happen. And also, unionists are enjoying this broader kind of culture. So I guess my question is, how are you, as a union, thinking about these solidarities? Is it something that you're just saying, whatever, that's just the media trying to pit us against each other, or this is something that we have to deal with? How do you think that this, to what extent does it make any difference at all that you see on the ground?
Well, you're right that we do have sort of the stereotype of being a militant union. And part of it is that we still have like a lot of attacks. Like, I mean, even women workers in our union would be attacked by police while we're doing a peaceful protest or something. Like at Korea Wiper Blades, they had, 3 times as many police swarm, like less than 200 women workers, so if we are not self-organized and disciplined, then we would not get anything done. So I mean, so on the one hand, it's not a total lie that we might have some kind of a sort of a militant culture inside, that people pay attention to what the schedule is, and then they figure out when they'll go to the bathroom so that they don't give trouble to the schedule, or like cause it to derail. Like, so people are sort of like that. And, at the same time, like even when the Myanmar coup d'etat happened, we had some Myanmar workers so I called all of the workplaces, the union leaders at the workplaces that had Myanmar migrant workers, and said, you help those migrant workers, because some of them wanted to protest the coup d'etat in Myanmar. And so like at our Daewoo shipbuilding local, they loaned out their speakers and headbands and things, and carved out some space so that the migrant workers could protest the coup d'etat, even from Korea, but they wanted to, right? So we have that kind of, like, we have the headbands, we have the speaker systems, and we will tell the company they have to have this space, we'll do that. But on the other hand, you're right. There are also like metal workers in our union who, uh, who are so I guess how, coming from this sort of history and culture that developed from sort of survival instincts, and also embracing that the world is more diverse, and you don't want to have you don't want to always be showing what might be thought of as, what do you call it, sort of toxic masculinity or something, right? So, I mean, but in our union too, though, even way before the Me Too movement, like way back in 2002, 2003, the militant women in our union protested inside our union in order to create like anti-sexual harassment clauses in our constitution. So in our constitution, we could fire, or we could expel a union member, which could lead to repercussions in the workplace, for committing sexual harassment, way like 2 decades before, the Me Too movement, came out. So even inside our union, we had this, and like in our union as well, for example, we innovated a human rights chapter in our model collective agreement. So the model collective agreement includes a definition of family that's not solely hetero. So because there's no comprehensive anti-discrimination law in Korea, people who are gay could be like fired, right? So, and they don't get anything, they don't have lots of legal recourse. So at least the trade union can try to define things differently in the collective agreement to protect the non-traditional families and to also, so that if you're in a non-traditional family, that you can still get leave to attend your spouse's, funeral or parents' funeral, or like to inherit and, to receive the same dignity and rights that, you would if you were part of the whatever the hetero, the normative, supposedly normative one. So I think this is something that was innovated in our trade union, and then we are trying to, so that like different leave and like benefits should accrue to non-traditional couples based on the definition of family that we put into the model collective agreement. And we try, in our own union too, like we realized after having being able to expel members for committing sexual harassment or having toxic masculinity or like what we call violence, like it could be verbal or whatever. We realize there's a gap between someone who has to be expelled from the union and the behavior we would wish for. And so we also created sort of soft guidelines, throughout in every region. They had to create some soft guidelines about the expected level of behavior. Like we shouldn't ask people, do you have kids? Because it makes people feel like, oh, it's the norm is to have kids. I'm supposed to have kids, and they're asking me why I don't have kids. Or we shouldn't ask, members, are you married? This is, like these are the kinds of things that we put in our soft guidelines so that, sure, where we came from, there was a lot of sort of militancy. On the other hand, we've made a lot of intentional efforts to make the culture open and also to advocate for people who could be sort of suppressed or, feel like not whole in this, situation. So, regarding the candlelight protest, so yesterday, actually, people, after that, Yoon's really strange, address that he sounded like, wow, he needs to go. He really sounded a little bit divorced from reality that everyone knows. Is he not following that the military, the police, and even the National Intelligence Service testimony pretty much, he's basically his speech sort of lied about even the times and lots of various things. But anyway, so yesterday's protest in Seoul, we actually went to Itaewon, and we were able to break through the police line and try to bring the protest closer to Yoon, who seems to be ensconced from reality. But then at the same time, you're right, at the night, the candlelight vigil protests, we have a lot of young women in the protests who are bringing the, K-pop 응원봉, little disco
Their
globes.
pride light sticks.
Yeah, the portable disco globes.
Yeah.
So actually last night, at the same time that we do have this militant movement and we broke through the police line and went to Itaewon, our union members also were holding the disco bulbs and little lighted star things, wands, in the candlelight protest because we want every space to be a safe space for everyone. And we want to be flexible enough to, when we have to go to rise up to the challenge to do various things to be heard, we'll try that. But then we also, want the broadest solidarity, and we are willing also to change ourselves to try to, I should be honest and say it's not easy all the time because, workers where they are not necessarily have a lot of the exposure and, discussion levels. So the trade union has an important role to play to set the tone and to try to improve the discussion level. So that was part of the, like I was saying, we have these soft guidelines where each region is required to write up this statement. It's partly to engage people in a discussion of what kind of a culture we want to have. We want to be a safe space for everyone. And, if there wasn't a document being adopted, people's discussion might be less engaged. But since the document is coming out and it'll reflect the region, we try to engage people in having these discussions. But
Yeah, it's so important to hear this, Hyewon, because, in a lot of ways, this is not what's being talked about in the media. And, the thoughtfulness and the care that the union has taken to change these everyday sensibilities and cultures. Last night, for example, in Jeju, it's a much smaller scale than, in Seoul, marching to Itaewon and going directly to Yoon's residence. But the fact that, when the MC announces that this is a space where we're going to respect people with disabilities, that we're going to respect the rights of sexual minorities, we're not going to treat youth in a paternalistic way, we're not going to be sexist or misogynist. This isn't the first time trade unionists are hearing this. And even if they don't agree, they've heard it before, either in the soft guidelines or in, the education, or even at the rallies that the union has. And so, this idea that Koreans are just militant and can all sort of kind of pop up in the streets together because we have some sort of quote unquote sort of collective culture, really, I think, masks all this important movement organizing work that has gone into making sure, for example, that young people will share their disco globe lights with old trade unionists, not to say they're old, with older, because, one of the things that's on the internet chat, I'm not on social media, but I hear like people all want to know where they can get these disco globes, and they're hard to get. So anyways.
Yeah, well, so
Yeah.
actually in every meeting that takes, trade unions are, basically a collective group, but in every meeting that takes place, the first page of the meeting booklet says basically our soft guidelines that, we will address each other respectfully, blah, 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 and, and don't make assumptions about other people and, that kind of thing. So it's not something we can take for granted. So that's why we keep putting it in front of people.
Right. I have two more short questions, and then Toby, I will give you a chance to ask any final ones. One question I wanted to make sure to ask is, from your perspective, I remember reading the Swedish paper, and you're quoted as saying you haven't eaten, slept, well, you don't know, you eat, breathe, live in the union office. And it sort of reminded me of the mid-90s when, union offices all have blankets and people eat and sleep there. But this is 20 years later. How do you sustain this level of commitment and intensity? And you yourself, if it's okay to share, said, you were planning for the end of the year, writing reports, summing up, not being in the streets every night, trying to figure out how to do your work as well as support this mass mobilization and take care of everything you do at home. So how do you sustain it personally? How do others? I think it's
I
quite.
haven't seen the Swedish article yet. So basically, I think I said I hadn't slept in like 4 days at that point when I met her. And so, when someone hasn't slept in 4 days, they look like, a little messier, right? So, but uh, I mean, I guess we've been through quite a long time though. So I mean, in the like 2009, 2010, around that time, we were even like having a computer that had a hard drive that you could pull out. So because what had happened before is like uh, if the authorities raid the trade union office and they take your computers, then no one, you're totally incapacitated for a long time because they're saying they're investigating. But then, so the idea is you would take out your hard drive and then run with it, So I mean, and I guess now that I think about it, like when I started at the KCTU, we were not legal yet. So we were legalized in 1999. So I guess because it was worse in the past, maybe, but yeah, so uh I can't really just say it was worse in the past. Well, the past was really terrible actually. So yeah. Uh and I think part of the past being terrible is why people value habeas corpus and other rights that some other people might take for granted. But and why we're fighting for trade union rights as well for everyone, because just having trade union rights for the big companies is not enough. But uh I I think it's easy to get burned out, but then we have a lot of good union members. I mean, I can't extol my union members enough, Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of good people you meet in the trade union movement. And I think that sort of keeps the energy going. Of course, there's also a lot of times where you're disappointed, things didn't, different struggles didn't turn out as you would have wished. But then, uh, yeah, I think part like one of the locals that really fought a very harsh union busting campaign. They said that the secret to their ability to win was partly that there was a lot of attention paid to union education, that people knew our values, people knew who we are, where we came from, people had, this kind of commonness. Then a second was that they received a lot of solidarity from other workers to support against their union busting. And the third was that all the workers really believed in one another. And that was really crucial to them being able to win against union busting. And, that was one of the locals. They fought against the long union busting, and the company was basically hiring thugs, ex-convicts, and using them as security guards and beating up workers. And, by their activism, they also got enacted different laws that changed, the rules about you have to have trained people who are hired for security. Companies can't just stand outside a prison and get ex-convicts and, put them into to suppress the trade union, that there should be like private security forces should have rules. And so like, I mean, all this is part of building democracy, and that's all the things that our members did, So, I mean, I feel like the I think one of the things that was very fortunate is that when I started, I was looking at various NGOs and places as well that had a lot of influence. But I really liked the, trade unions because they were really grassroots based. So we are a membership organization, we are not like an NGO who just decides whatever and then they can do it. We have to go through discussions and build an internal, organization that can be resilient. And so I think that's also part of what enables you to keep going is the members actually. So I mean that's one of the, I'm grateful to be part of a grassroots membership-based organization.
It's really truly inspiring to hear you talk. And I realized it's not 20 years, it's 30 years.
Yeah, it's quite a long time. Yeah. To be still like yeah, and I think it's not just me, but almost every trade unionist has like, a toothbrush and a pair of socks in their office drawer, you never know. Yeah.
The final question I want to ask is just about international solidarity. I know, and Toby, you might have something to add to this, but I know you do a lot of work supporting also solidarity at the international level, and you must be getting so many phone calls and so many, not maybe phone calls, texts, messages from international unions about how to support, how to give solidarity. What from the union's perspective, kind of solidarity is helpful right now, and what might we be able to share with the UCLA community?
Well, actually, solidarity messages have been streaming in from trade unions across the globe, like from basically every corner of the globe, Germany, Serbia, the United States, Brazil, Italy. I mean, I guess yeah, of course, India and the rest of, so that I think, yeah, we have been getting a lot of solidarity letters, which we have been sharing with our union members, as well as, we issued a press release. I think the union somehow thinks that the outside world, won't care if he clings to power and continues to do these kinds of things. But yeah, it's kind of tough. So like, when we had workers out on strike, for example, they went to their the district office of the ruling party because the ruling party had undermined an impeachment vote from happening by making the parliament not have the quorum for the vote. And so I don't know if if members of the PPP party will visit the US or, anything, but so we don't have like a specific concrete request to the UCLA community, but then I think if you look at our poster, again, to step down Yoon sort of reminds you of this book, right? Hankang. I brought the English version, but the I think that people know and that people understand. I think Hankang was also saying in her Nobel, she recently won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and a lot of what she wrote about was the violence in the military under martial law regimes, and how violent control uh, and she was saying that that she still has hope, and because that language in itself intrinsically has is unable to be suppressed in that way, and that uh, this kind of innate power inside of language sort of will not change. And if we were able to overcome like the martial law periods of the past, then this unchanging power of language and reflection and understanding will be important to shaping our future. And so I really feel like people being aware and understanding what's at stake, understanding what happened, will help us in the road to the future. So I mean, right now, we are sort of dissatisfied also with having a two-party system. It seems inadequate because, even the opposition party, where all the focus is right now, uh, the Democratic Party, even when they were in power, for example, really, they weren't fulfilling all of the labor rights that the international polity has put down as the baseline even. And so we really had to push them to ratify the ILO conventions. We had several strikes, and a lot of, actions. So I hope, so our union in our last strike directive, one of the headings is that we want to have more worker-centered democracy, so that, it's not just switching out various ruling elites for other ruling elites, but that we can uplift everyone through democracy. So, and everyone is, a lot of people are working, whether it's paid or unpaid. And we hope that, yeah, that having an understanding and an analysis of power and reflection about, what has happened in our society and our limitations, and how that will help to shed light on the road forward. And I think just people being interested and engaged, I really thank you all. And, I'm sure that, building democracy meaningfully for, to make it work for everyone is not just our task, but something that we can do together with other people who are like-minded. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much,
Thanks so
Hyewon.
much, Hyewon.
That was a beautiful summary, and you really even answered the question I had, which was, what is the future that you're looking towards? And of course, we're all hoping that things work out for you and the people of Korea and democracy and democratic unionism there. I want to thank Jennifer Chun and Hyewon Chong for this fabulous conversation. And we hope to check in with you again sometime in the future to get an update.
Thanks very much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
you.